From the University of Notre Dame, these are Notre Dame Stories. In this episode, a look at preservation. A Notre Dame engineer is aiming to increase the number of successful heart transplants in the U.S. And an alumna is working at the Vatican Museums, helping to maintain the artwork that has symbolized faith and culture for centuries.
It is a relatively recent field. The term coined early 90s, I believe. If I recall correctly, there was a paper in Science magazine. Tissue Engineering was the title of the paper, and it was 1993 or around that time. And the idea there was to use fabrication methods that can create materials that are biocompatible, meaning that it wouldn't cause any adverse effects if you put in the body of an individual.
Pinar Zorlatuna is an associate professor in the Department of Aerospace and Mechanical Engineering. She specializes in tissue engineering, especially mimicking natural biochemical reactions with fabricated materials.
Say you end up having a heart attack or a broken bone with a large defect that cannot be healed by itself. The idea there is to use materials that can guide the cells to grow in a similar fashion to the ones that grow in your body and create functional tissues in the lab, test them obviously, and then put them back in the patient so that that defect that cannot be healed by the regenerative processes of the body can be remedied by that intervention.
Okay, so it sounds similar maybe to a concept I think a lot of people are familiar with, maybe skin grafting.
Yes.
Okay.
But the difference being is, in the case of a skin grafting or an organ transplant, you are taking another viable organ or a tissue from either some part like located in a different part of your body or from a different individual, and you're transferring it. In the case of the tissue engineering, the goal is to create that from scratch. So you start with just materials and cells that are oftentimes like adult stem cells that can be produced in large amounts. Just you need a tiny bit of a biopsy from the patient, not a whole skin part from the back. As opposed to that, it is like a less invasive procedure if it can be succeeded.
Okay. Anything new, people maybe view it with a little bit of skepticism, but especially if we're talking about humans and engineering, you get those two words together, people kind of maybe step back a little bit. Have you encountered that?
Oftentimes, my encounters were on the other end. People get too excited. Okay, when I'm getting my new heart, or obviously it is way down the road. This is all baby steps towards trying to create such organs in the lab that can be really functional and used by the patients. But obviously there are good reasons to be unsure how or when it can be succeeded, because it's a really hard grand challenge.
You've been published a couple times for two applications of this.
So stepping back and kind of actually building up on your previous question, when this term first coined, everyone was so excited in very short period of time. We will have these off-the-shelf tissues that can be used right and left, which didn't happen obviously because it's, as I just said, it's a very hard challenge. And by time people realized that while trying to push this field forward for regenerative studies where the goal is to heal people, you can also use these models to study the disease and potentially come up with some preventive approaches or even try drugs and other treatments. And the two specific studies you talked about is in the line of that. And the one about cancer is creating an in vivo model of cancer, which is really human relevant. And what do I mean by that? Currently, majority of preclinical biomedical research is done using animals. And this is all great because it gives a lot of insight about what a whole complex organism responds to a certain drug, how a disease progresses. But on the downside, most of the diseases that are really interesting to us not even inherently occur in those animal species that we are looking at. So you need to first create the disease, you create things called humanized mice, but then again, it is still mice, it is not human. There is currently a big gap in clinical translation of those preclinical studies. And I'll give you numbers. On average, 1 out of 10 studies that show perfect response in animals end up being useful in the clinic when they are tried. So it is a 10% about success rate on average of any drug or treatment that is currently being produced using this pipeline of preclinical study approach. So it is very obvious that there needs to be some other approach, and it's not meant to replace the animal studies altogether, but maybe in parallel, using these human tissues that are made through this process of tissue engineering as disease models.
In other words, something successful in animal trials, normally the next step would be clinical.
Yes.
But this could come in between and say, hey, here's another fail-safe before we get there. Yes. Why don't we spend some more time?
Yes, okay. Because failed clinical trials is not only a lot of money that's spent, also it can be dangerous and also time-consuming. It delays the potential remedies from reaching to people who need them.
So in some ways, this might add another step, but it actually might be more efficient to do it this way.
Yes, also it can be done in parallel at one point to speed up things. And the other good thing about it is you can do it in a way that is high throughput. And what I mean by that is it is fairly expensive and not very ethical to produce a large cohort of animals and try everything right and left. Not really paying attention to the specific goal, but in some cases you want to try things with not having those restrictions in mind. So you may use these tissues as a large-scale trial platform for narrowing down things and then try them in larger animals, for example. So it can go both ways. It can be a step after or it can be a step before and do the final toxicity, systemic toxicity studies, for example, after making sure that at least to some extent it works.
Okay. Talk to me more about the breast cancer study, because it seems like we learned something about the types of tissue and how cancer reacts to or responds in there, right?
Yes. So in the model we created, we were aiming to study how the surrounding fat cells in the breast tissue plays a role in the progress of cancer. So many tissues consist of more than one cell type. And in the breast tissue, you have these fat cells that are very prominent in the tissue. And fat cells, you wouldn't guess, but very active for in producing things that can keep the cancer cells happy, because they are cells that produce these things called growth factors. And growth factors can be utilized by cancer to spread easier. And the cells that actually produce these are pre-fat cells. They are not fully differentiated cells in the sense that they are not really specified fat cells yet, but they are pre-fat cells, which are more like stem cells. And what we looked in our study is we created a model where we have these pre-fat cells that are stem cell-like cells that sit in the vicinity of that cancer growing, and how cancer manipulates those cells to stay in that more stem-like state and produce more of these goodies, because once they are fully turned into fat cells, they are not that good at producing those good things, growth factors and so on, that can be used by the cancer to invade further. So more interestingly, we saw that the stiffness of the surrounding tissue actually affects that. So if the environment is more stiffer, cancer cell is better in manipulating those cells. And that's an observation we were able to make because we had this disease model outside of the animal tissue or human tissue where we can play around with these parameters one by one.
The other one is the heart transplant. That was really fascinating to me too, because like you said, it's the idea of creating this tissue and then testing something. In this case, prolonging the viability of hearts that are in transit. I wonder if you could just kind of go through that study with us too.
Sure. The important thing about that project, when you have a heart transplant, you want to take it to someone that's in need. You cannot do experiments on it. And because of that, the standard transfer solution that has been used for decades. And there is not much progress on it because no one wants to risk using a viable heart in the expense of doing research. Mm-hmm. And in the case of the animal studies, you end up getting differential responses because they're mouse, and also mouse transplants are very different than human transplants because
I can imagine so.
Yeah, you oftentimes have very genetically similar individuals among mouse because they are produced in the lab for that particular purpose. So we used this model and we came up with a stem cell based, this time a different type of stem cell based goodies that they produce for keeping cells longer alive, and we tested different combinations of and concentrations of those on these tissues we created in the lab and came up with a cocktail that can be added to that standard solution that you preserve the hearts currently and effectively doubling up the time. So that being said, this needs to be again tested in larger animals, but this was an example where you can start with human samples and do a high throughput analysis of multiple things before you go ahead and try it finally in a complete organism like a pig model or a larger animal model.
It's fascinating to me. I'm curious, back to the field of tissue engineering. What's on the horizon there? What are new applications? Where's this going?
One big push on the field of tissue engineering is creating more 3D printed organs. So not only you want to create these organs specific for a patient, but also ideally we envision like operating rooms where you have a 3D printer set up in one side of the room, and during the operation the clinician will need a part of the leg to be recreated or part of the heart to be recreated, and the 3D printer will print in situ. And this sounds like a science fiction, but I think it will happen in our lifetime. Even right now, when I go to my dentist, in my dentist's office, there's a 3D printer that they're printing fillings, ceramic fillings. So we are not that far. I mean, it will take time to get there, but one of the more science fiction-y visions is having that kind of aid right there in the operating room. And the other big push, obviously, is in this general theme of personalized medicine. So it also aligns with the models that I was talking about. So say you're a high-risk heart attack individual, you had your family going through these heart attack patients already, and you can have your own little heart attack models created and test drugs on it or see how susceptible you are indeed. And same for cancer, you can have your pre-drug screening cancer models before the actual drug administered to see how it can treat your own particular type of cancer.
Like you said, it does sound science fiction-y, but that's got to be part of the appeal of being in the field.
Yeah, definitely.
Pinar Zurlotuna, thank you very much.
Thank you.
In Rome, there are certain days people will wait upwards of a few hours in the line to enter the Vatican museums. Millions of people queue up for the experience each year, and the highlight of that experience for many is the chance to enter the Sistine Chapel, where the frescoes of Michelangelo adorn the walls and ceiling. There was a time not long ago, however, when it seemed the sacred site's popularity may be its undoing. You see, the millions of visitors were bringing with them an excess of dirt and body heat and, get this, breath, and that was rising to the ceiling and resting on the masterpiece paintings. It threatened to break down the pigment and destroy the works over time. But breathe easy, an American air conditioning company stepped in and donated a new ventilation system that solved the problem. If a solution couldn't be reached, the Vatican was mulling some kind of virtual experience wherein visitors could see the creation of Adam in pixels, not paint. Not exactly something worth waiting in line for.
I think when you consider the 6 million annual visitors to the Vatican museums, these 6 million people bringing with them this absolute mania and fervor for the Sistine Chapel and Raphael rooms, for which they wait hours in line to see in person. When you consider these things, you can really begin to comprehend art's significance in society. People travel for art. They plan trips of a lifetime to Rome to see the Sistine Chapel and St. Peter's Basilica, because these facets of the Vatican museums are conceived by our visitors not only as masterpieces, but as peak culture.
That's 2017 Notre Dame graduate Sofia Bevacqua. She's in the midst of a 5-year fellowship at the Vatican museums.
My job at the Vatican Museums is most closely aligned with 7 different art restoration laboratories, the largest restoration laboratory complex in any museum in the world. And I function as an intermediary between the needs of these restoration laboratories to complete and finance restoration projects, such as the frescoes of the Sistine Chapel, and a donor base of about 2,400 individuals who give perennially to the Vatican museums. So I work with the laboratories to decide which works in the galleries need restoration, which methods and technologies will be employed in the labor of the restoration, and finally, how much it's going to cost.
Sofia studied abroad in London, where she completed an internship at the prestigious Dulwich Picture Gallery. We caught up with her at the Rome Global Gateway, where her advisor, Heather Hyde Miner, is director. It was Miner's offer to come to Rome for another project that initially drew Sofia here, and at almost the same time, the opportunity at the Vatican opened up.
I was really fortunate that things worked out the way it did, especially as an art history major. Everyone's saying you're not getting a job, but so I think working at both the Dulwich Picture Gallery in London and at the Vatican Museums, I've learned to kind of convey and discuss art with a wider audience beyond the dialectic academic one, and also with many different types of audiences in both of these cultures. And for me, this discussion that you have with the museum goer, be it a literal discussion or in a curriculum that you develop or a text you write, is the most important part of the whole experience, because that discussion instigates the connection with your museum goer, with your viewer, which hopefully they'll take with them after they leave the museum.
But only if there are works to discuss, and that's where you can't help but observe an interesting mix of science and faith. The Vatican museums employ cutting-edge technology in the service of work that is wholly creative, if not spiritual.
And restoration, then, is cultural maintenance by restoring the splendor of our various sculptures, paintings, architectural monuments, so that we may give to these new pilgrims, in a way, the experience as the Renaissance and Baroque masters intended it to be. Also, I think that restoration is a way for us to kind of perpetually revisit the past, because when studying an object, its objecthood, not as a work of art surrounded by theory, you're able to glean a more profound understanding of how it was made, and often why it was made in that century.
And it's made for a blending of a professional and personal experience that will shine brilliantly on the canvas of Sofia's life.
Particularly at the Vatican, there's been not only a language barrier, Italian not being my first language, to work with, but also a 2,000-year-old very hierarchical culture that you are expected to respectfully assimilate into, but also learning how to navigate your own way within this kind of bizarre, hermetically sealed culture, so that your own work can shine through. I think that entire experience has really helped my professional development. I think being raised Catholic in South Bend, Indiana, and then attending the University of Notre Dame, this is just kind of another chapter of like the Catholic experience, which in Rome takes on a heavy art-filled significance. And being able to attach kind of the theology of Catholicism that you learn in Notre Dame to a myriad of visual narrative illustrations within the epicenter of Catholic faith has been a really amazing experience.
For more Notre Dame stories, visit nd.edu. The Notre Dame Stories podcast is produced by the Office of Public Affairs and Communications.